Hello, everybody. Tis I, yours truly. Just thought I'd give a little brief history lesson on what happened here at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. On June 30th of 1863, Union General Buford arrives at Gettysburg. However, he knows that there's a Confederate force right somewhere on the outside of town, miles away, but they're heading towards his direction. He knows he doesn't have enough men, so that very night he writes a letter requesting for reinforcements. The next following morning, July 1st, the battle begins. General Buford sets up a defense line to repel Confederate forces that were being led by General Heath. For the first part, Union troops were pretty successful. They were shooting at Confederate forces, they were repelling every advancement that they made, but Confederate forces were still pushing forward, and they were actually getting close to Union lines. But as good timing would have it, General Reynolds, who responds to General Buford's request for reinforcements, arrives. He arrives from the south, goes through the town, meets up with General Buford. General Buford gives him the details, what's going on. General Reynolds says, okay, I'm going to lead my men into combat. As he's pushing his men, or as he's leading his men against the Confederate forces, important to know that General Reynolds was a very ambitious leader. He loved being on the front lines. He loved to lead his men. He was always trying to set a good example. However, as he turned around to look at his men, he was yelling out, "For God's sake, men, keep pushing forward!" He was shot in either the back of the neck or the back of the head. Nobody really knows the exact detail, but either way, he was dead even before he fell off his horse. He was the first general to be killed during this battle. Even though Union troops just lost their commanding officer, but they were still fighting. They held their ground. They were fighting off whatever advancement the enemy was coming with. But for the most part, in the early morning, Union troops were doing very good. However, around the afternoon, when the afternoon approached, things took a turn for the worst. It was, Confederate forces estimated to be about as large as 30,000. Union forces, 18 to 20,000. When the Union forces that were defending the northern part of the town started to collapse, the rest of this defense line also started to retreat. Confederate forces started to push in. They were chasing Union soldiers through the town of Gettysburg. Union soldiers were scattering every other which way. Eventually, Union soldiers that were lucky enough to escape the town of Gettysburg retreated to Cemetery Hill. So day one was a Confederate success. They pushed back Union forces. They pushed them out of the town. They took control of the town. Later on, General Lee arrives later on that day with his main force, and he has behind him at least 70 to 75,000 Confederate soldiers from Virginia and many other southern states. Now, day one, Confederate victory. Now for the main question, what was day two going to bring? Well, shortly after Confederates pushed back the Union, or the Yankee troops, whatever you prefer, General Meade, who was actually the supreme Army commander of the Potomac. That's what the Union troops were called that were fighting here. He developed a very unique defense position that represented the exact shape of a fishhook, most of which covered high grounds, and I mean the terrain kind of varied. I mean, there was high ground and it went down to level ground. Gettysburg was a very unique area to fight in. So General Lee expands his army all the way from Culp's Hill, all the way down through Cemetery Hill and down what is known as Cemetery Ridge. As the Confederate forces, they were on the other side, what was known as Seminary Ridge. There was a lot of fighting going on the second day of battle. General Lee is trying to find some way where he can break this line. The line was actually pretty strong, and the Union forces just really had a pretty good defense. However, one Union commander practically jeopardized everything. General Sickles, who sometimes was kind of considered to be a problem most of the time, decided to take his men he was actually positioned right nearby Little Round Top, and instead of staying right where he was at, he didn't like his position, so he decided to advance his men forward. Now, here was the thing. This was a solid line, heavy. It was really thick. I mean, Confederate forces were still trying to find ways how to break through it. He just created a window of opportunity for it. As he advanced forward towards Peach Orchard, where he bumps into Confederate forces led by General Barksdale. These two commanders are now leading their men into combat. They're fighting over this level terrain, and somewhere along the line, General Barksdale discovers the serious error that General Sickles created. He knew if he can break through these Union troops, he can get through that gap that goes between Little Round Top and the rest of the Union line. And if he can get through there, he can flank the whole Union forces. Matter of fact, thousands of other Confederate soldiers can go right through there and flank the whole Union army, and all would have been lost. So you can probably imagine the excitement he had going through his head. But first he had to get through General Sickles. General Sickles is still holding his ground. He's losing a lot of men, but they're still fighting. Somewhere along the line, General Sickles gets hit in the right leg by a cannonball. So, needless to say, he's pretty much on the ground in agonizing pain as his troops are dragging him back towards the Union lines. And when this is going on, General Barksdale is pushing his men forward. They're trying to advance towards this gap that he knows is there. But as he gets close to the gap, he's met with Union reinforcements. Where did these guys come from? Well, General Meade knew that something was going on. He didn't exactly know. He didn't exactly know what General Sickles did. The thing here is, even though General Sickles is a general, but General Meade is the main commanding officer, why not ask permission if he can go forward? Here's the thing. General Sickles and General Meade did not like one another. They hated one another. They could not look at one another. That's just how bad it was. And when you got an enemy force of 75,000 strong, kind of a bad time to hold a grudge. But at any rate, so when General Meade suspected that there was something going on the lower end of his defense line, he decides to send one of his other senior officers, General Warren, to go down there and figure out what the heck's going on. When General Warren discovers what General Sickles did, naturally, he informs General Meade. So General Meade has to take other reinforcements from other parts of this line right here and to fill in that gap. So right before General Barksdale was able to reach that destination, he is met with Union reinforcements. Now, General Barksdale, as he was advancing towards this gap that he thought was there, or he thought it was still there, he was actually hit in the left thigh, and he was bleeding pretty badly. He was asked to leave and to get medical attention, but he refused. He was excited to lead his men in this battle, knowing that he can get through this line. Later on, he gets hit in the left foot, but still continues to lead his men. And as I stated earlier, when he bumped into those Union reinforcements, eventually he is shot in the chest. This time he goes down. And I think he was, as he laid there mortally wounded, he was, I think, taken prisoner, where he died the next day. So, Confederate forces were able to take over what is known as Peach Orchard, but they were never able to break through that defense line that was quickly reinforced. But the fight was not over yet, for even though General Barksdale had been repelled, General Hood, who was further south, was advancing towards Little Round Top. Now, when I mentioned earlier about General Warren being sent down to investigate what's going on, well, after he got this gap filled in, he also quickly realized that, hey, there's a Little Round Top over here, but nobody's here to man it, and miles away he can see Confederate forces heading in this general direction. He knows that if Little Round Top falls into Confederate hands, again, they could be flanked. So he's quickly trying to scatter, or trying to find other reinforcements he can put here. Now, in the movie Gettysburg, it primarily shows Colonel Chamberlain being assigned here, which he was. However, he was not the only colonel that was fighting on Little Round Top. There were also two other colonels, Colonel Vincent, and Colonel O'Rourke. However, it was basically Colonel Vincent that informed Colonel Chamberlain, okay, this is the end of the line. You gotta hold this line. You cannot fall back. You cannot retreat. You cannot surrender. Because if you do, this whole section just falls, and again, the Union will be flanked. Now, Colonel Vincent, I don't really know where he was specifically located at, but yes, he also encountered Confederate forces, and eventually another colonel, as I mentioned earlier, Colonel O'Rourke, came in to help him when they were about to be overrun. But Colonel O'Rourke was actually also mortally wounded in terms of supporting Colonel Vincent when he needed reinforcements. But as for Colonel Chamberlain, he was also encountering a lot of Confederate troops trying to go up this hill to take over Little Round Top. And, of course, when you have control of high ground, you basically got the best position that there is, because the enemy has to move up towards you. And this particular hill was kind of steep, and there were a lot of Confederate soldiers that thought, man, I have never been up such a steep hill until I encountered Little Round Top. But as the day went on and intense fighting continued, Colonel Chamberlain was informed that most of the men have exhausted most of their ammunition, and Confederate forces are still moving up towards his direction. As a last-ditch effort, he ordered his men to fix bayonets. And when Confederate forces again started advance upwards, he ordered one of his officers uh, to be on the left side, and when the order was given, they were to swing down, basically like a door, and then and then Colonel Chambers' forces would just shoot straight forward towards the enemy. Basically, it was to cause maybe some minor confusion, which it did. And when the orders were given, the Union when Colonel Chamberlain gave the orders, the Union soldiers charged down at the enemy. They pushed back the Confederate forces, and when they got down to the hill, Confederate troops just retreated back to Devil's Den. And in the movie, after Colonel Chamberlain had pushed back the rebels, allegedly it kind of ended right there, making you think that, okay, the Battle of Little Round Top was over. Later on, before the day's end, another Confederate unit made another attempt to take that hill, but failed. And that was like later on towards the early evening. So, but again, there was still plenty of fighting going on. Before the day was over, up at Culp's Hill, Confederate forces were advancing. Culp's Hill was another high ground area. Again, the Confederates never took over Culp's Hill. However, they took over some of the other defense positions that the Union had in front of Culp's Hill. There were some other hills, and there were some trench lines. Confederates took that day. But in that same evening, Union troops went down and surprise attacked some of those Confederate soldiers and pushed them out. So Culp's Hill was never taken, and Union soldiers were able to push out the Confederate troops that attacked earlier that day, and were able to regain some ground that they lost earlier. And, well, so the second day of battle, Confederates almost had a break, almost were successful in breaching the line, but again, they didn't. So, July 3rd. Now, General Lee knew that today had to be the day he had to win. He had to break the line somewhere. He had to be successful in something in order to win this battle. He kind of focused in a little bit on the Union, this one spot, which was basically the center of the line. When on the second day of battle, as I mentioned earlier, some reinforcements were used to help fill up gaps, because General Lee was hitting the high ground, he was hitting the low ground, or of the fishhook, he was hitting Culp's Hill, he was hitting Little Round Top. Reinforcements were used to help Union forces hold the line. By doing that, you weaken the center. And he knew this. He knew that if there was any chance that he was going to win, he had to pierce, or he had to breach this one specific spot in the line. On July 3rd, he was talking with his trusted general, General Longstreet, explaining his plan, what he was going to do. General Longstreet, on the other hand, was very skeptical of the idea. He actually even looked at General Lee and said, "I do believe this attack will fail. It's more than a mile's march. When our boys come out of the trees, they'll be exposed to Yankee artillery, and plus on top of that, the Union now has a stone wall." And in his Longstreet was actually a pretty knowledgeable officer, and General Lee trusted Longstreet with a lot of things, but General Lee was still persistent. He still believed that if victory is going to happen today, it has to happen at this spot. So, later on, General Lee basically puts everything into General Longstreet's hands, tells him, you may commence the attack whenever you're ready. At, I believe it was around 1300 hours, 1 o'clock p.m. for those of you who don't know military time, 160 Confederate cannons fired onto this basically thin spot right here. Now, General Lee, he had a lot of, he basically timed this out. He only wanted this cannon barrage to go on for only about 30 minutes. It went on for almost 2 hours. Hour 45, 2 hours minimum is how long it stretched out to. During this time, you got Confederates, you got Union cannons firing at one another. There were towns 30, maybe 40 miles away can actually hear all this going on. I mean, and on top of that, some of the concussions that the projectiles created around soldiers were doing a lot of internal damage to them. Matter of fact, there were some soldiers that recorded had blood coming out of their ears. That's just how powerful this was. Now, the other thing is that when these cannons fire, they create a thick cloud of smoke. On this day, there was little to no wind. So as this artillery barrage is going on, you got like a thick cloud of smoke. Your view of what's going on in front of you, you really can't see. Thus, meaning you're aiming the cannon, and your accuracy is not going to be that good. Matter of fact, some of these guys were overshooting. They were shooting well past the lines that they were originally aiming at. Somehow, I don't know how they did that, but I mean, even the Confederate forces, they were shooting their cannons well past the Union defense line, so far that General Meade had to reposition his headquarters. And after almost 2 hours went by, Union guns started to go silent. They were not firing back. Confederate forces, or the Confederate guns were still firing for a little while longer, but then eventually they stopped, thinking, okay, we did our job. We either knocked out the guns, or they exhausted their ammo, or they probably took them off the battlefield. Who knows? At this point, Confederate infantrymen are coming out of the tree lines and forming up. Now, in the movie, it shows General Garnett, General Kemper, and General Armistead. But there were actually several other generals that were also about to make this march, known as Pickett's Charge. There was also General Pettigrew, General Trimble, I believe is how you pronounce his name, and also General Anderson. But at any rate, this charge that they were about to make was going to be known as Pickett's Charge, even though you had all these other Confederate generals, but I think this whole division, or some of these divisions, belonged to Pickett. And later on, I think General Pickett asked, would this be the perfect time? Asked General Longstreet, would this be the perfect time to advance, sir? He gave the orders, and once these Confederate soldiers got in position, once they were lined up, they started marching forward. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Union guns went silent. They did not go silent because Confederate cannons might have destroyed some of the Union guns, or they exhausted their ammo, or whatever the story may be. Union guns went silent because Union commanders told them to cease fire. Some of you are probably thinking, why would you do that when you're being shot at? It was a way to lure the Confederate infantry to come out. Now, even when they came out of the trees in formation, they still didn't fire because, if you did that, then all they had to do was run back to the tree line and you would continue on with cannon fire for who knows how long. But as these Confederate soldiers were marching forward, at first nothing was going on. They were marching. The Union artillerymen were cheering them on as they were walking by them. And, at first, Confederate infantry thought, okay, this is going to be an easy march. But after they got like a quarter mile, give or take, Union artillery began to fire back right at them. So you can probably imagine the surprised look on their faces when well over 100 Union cannons started to open fire on them again. But at this point, it was kind of too late to to fall back. You've already committed yourself to go forward. So it was estimated about 15,000 Confederate troops were advancing towards this one thin line where the enemy was thinned or weakened, whatever you want to say about it. As these men were marching up towards that centerpiece, they were walking what was known as the jaws of death, because you got all these Union guns firing right into them. They're killing them by the hundreds. I mean, every step they took, it was just artillery or explosions just going on all around them, in their lines and everything. These guys were getting shot up pretty badly. And on top of that, when they got about to the 400-yard range, well, not only did the Union infantry start to get up and start shooting at them, the Union cannons, the artillerymen that were firing the cannons, altered from shooting a cannonball to a canister shot, which basically turned the cannon into a giant shotgun. A canister shot would hold at least 50 to 100 rounds of little round balls about yay big. So you can imagine the destruction that did to Confederate forces as they were marching upward. Now, General Garnett eventually was hit somewhere in the torso. Or no, not Garnett. General Kemper was hit somewhere in the torso, fell off his horse, and was dragged back to Seminary Ridge. As for General Garnett, when he got close to the wall, he had a certain leg injury, so naturally he's riding his horse from Seminary Ridge up to Cemetery Ridge. So at some given point, he decided to gallop up there. Little did he know, according to the movie, he was killed by a cannon. Possibly a canister shot, or he could have been shot down by an infantryman. Either way, he was killed, advancing towards the wall, which basically left General Armistead, who was coming up from the rear of these two divisions. Anyway, as he got to a certain point, a lot of these Confederate troops were a little shell-shocked. So to inspire them, he took his hat, stuck it on the tip of his saber, and, "With me, who will come with me? Come on, boys, let's give them the cold steel." And basically the cold steel represented the bayonet. So he actually charges up towards the wall. He is actually the first Confederate general to make it to the wall and to get over it. And behind him was about 400 or 500 other Confederate soldiers following him. But as General Garnett advanced, I want to say maybe 10 yards past the wall, he is shot in the chest and mortally wounded. The rest of his men are still following and the hand-to-hand combat begins. And this was anything but a fair fight. If you took your rifle, you aimed it and shot at somebody. If you couldn't shoot, you used your rifle as a club. If you had a bayonet, you'd use that. But if you didn't have the bayonet, if you didn't have your rifle, you would pull out a knife, or maybe your bayonet and use it as a knife. Or if it even came right down to it, your own bare hands, you would strangle somebody to death. This was a vicious fight. But of course, Union soldiers or Union reinforcements started to come in and would fire into Confederate troops that were advancing, and then charged right into them. And by this time, there was, as I said, about 15,000 Confederate forces going up on this wall. By the time Confederate forces were able to reach the wall, more than half of them were killed or mortally wounded, either way. So, as for the Confederate forces that were still advancing, there was probably about 6,000, maybe less. And after realizing what they're seeing in front of them, that whoever goes over that wall basically gets killed or captured, and more Union reinforcements is coming in and shooting right into them, they basically knew that the fight was over. So whatever remaining, or the 6,000 or less that remained on the other side of the wall, basically turned around and retreated. Later on, as shortly after the fight is over, General Armistead is captured, but he dies 2 days later. But before that, as Confederate troops were retreating back to Seminary Ridge, General Pickett informs General Lee, I don't have a division. I lost all my troops. With that being said, General Lee basically knew not only did he just lose this fight, he lost a battle. So, afterwards, on July 4th, General Lee creates a defense thinking that the Union is going to go and attack him the next day. But General Meade did not give in to this, and there was no attack on Confederate forces on July 4th. Later on that day, General Lee is ordering for a retreat back to Virginia. As he retreated, the Union, obviously it was a Union victory. They won, they held the line, and the Battle of Gettysburg was over. At any rate, I hope you all enjoyed that. Have a nice day. Talk to you soon.